Felix Adler hated Mondays. Not because they marked the start of another tedious work week though that was bad enough, but because they were dangerous. Mondays had a way of pulling him into the kind of crazy, unpredictable messes that only a quantum physicist with a disregard for safety protocols could ever find himself in. It wasn't like he wanted to create chaos. He just had this annoying habit of accidentally unraveling reality before breakfast. This Monday, however, was different. Felix had a new plan. He was going to solve the greatest problem in quantum mechanics, time travel. And this time, it was going to work. Sure, he'd tried before over and over. But this time, he had something the world had never seen, the Chronobox, a device so mysterious and complex it could, theoretically, transport someone through time with only a bit of fine-tuning and a complete disregard for the basic laws of physics. It was a beautiful mess of wires, glowing screens, and an unreasonably large button labeled, "Do not press." Naturally, Felix had pressed it several times in a variety of controlled experiments. None of them had gone well. But today was going to be different. The Chronobox had finally aligned with the perfect quantum state. Just another cup of coffee and we're good to go, Felix muttered to himself, though he knew full well that no amount of caffeine could erase the fact that he was about to do something monumentally idiotic. He reached for the mug beside him. His hand shook a little. He hadn't slept much the night before, too busy tweaking the equations on the back of a napkin. It was ready, before Felix could take a sip. Disaster struck. The mug wobbled in his hand as a sudden wave of quantum instability rippled through the room. The Chronobox, in all its glowing glory, emitted a violent pulse of light. Felix had only enough time to blink before the coffee mug, the device, and most of his belongings vanished along with a portion of his sense of reality. The whole thing happened so quickly that Felix had no idea what hit him. He looked down at the floor, where his coffee mug had been only moments before. Gone. Vanished. Like it never existed at all. What the hell? Felix asked, swiping a hand through his disheveled hair, eyes darting around. He had an inkling something very wrong had just happened, but the quantum ripples were still distorting his perception. He was seeing double or triple images of himself. Some were hunched over the workbench scribbling, others were examining the device with exaggerated care, and one version of him seemed to be making an impromptu sandwich with no regard for physics or clean eating. His stomach churned. A low hum vibrated through the room. The Chronobox flickered erratically, and with it, his perception of time. For a second, Felix was everywhere. And nowhere did he rub his eyes. The walls around him stretched and folded like cheap tinfoil. Okay, calm down, Felix muttered, grabbing his tablet off the desk and staring at the cracked screen. His mind raced through the facts. He'd accidentally activated a quantum time loop. More specifically, the Chronobox had sent him into a multiverse. Or, at least, that's the best guess he could make from the increasingly bizarre spatial-temporal distortion. The worst part? He had no idea where he was. Or rather, which version of him was in this reality. Suddenly, the room expanded. Felix could hear his voice from another timeline, shouting, arguing with someone. He glanced to his left. Sure enough, there was another version of him, this one animated with a particularly sarcastic flair, lecturing a bewildered intern about the importance of precise quantum measurements. "You're in a different dimension, Felix," this version of him grinned. "Didn't you read the manual?" Felix blinked at him. "You're not me," he muttered. "I'm me, remember?" The sarcasm fueled Felix from the other timeline laughed and sipped an invisible drink. "Oh, I am you, all right. Just, a different you. But don't worry, you'll get used to it. It's part of the fun." The fun? Felix gritted his teeth. This was not how time travel was supposed to go. And yet, there it was. He'd managed to create a quantum virus, infecting himself and the entire lab with a glitch that allowed him to exist in multiple versions of time and space all at once. In theory, this meant every choice he made spawned a new version of reality. This was, in essence, the beginning of the quantum virus. Except Felix hadn't realized it yet. Felix, the sarcastic version called out, you should probably take a look at that thing before it goes nuclear. Also, don't look down. Felix hesitated. Against every instinct, he glanced at the floor. What he saw nearly made his brain short-circuit. His own coffee mug was there, standing upright. He stared at it in horror and then, without warning, it started to float. Slowly, it rose up into the air like a balloon on helium, hovering just above the ground. Felix watched, slack-jawed, as the mug wobbled, shimmering like a weird hologram of itself. "This is bad," Felix said, his voice cracking slightly. "This is very, very bad." The version of him still standing next to the bench just shrugged. "It's not like we haven't been worse off. Remember that time you accidentally reversed gravity at the science fair? Or when you turned the professor into a pile of talking jello?" Felix rubbed his temples, feeling the headache building. The mug still floating spilled the last dregs of its coffee and then, before Felix could react, a ripple of reality hit him hard in the chest. Felix woke up on the floor. Not sure how he got there. He blinked rapidly, attempting to piece together what had happened. The strange quantum distortions had faded. For a moment, everything seemed normal. The room, the lab, the comforting hum of machines, but then he saw something strange. Something wrong. That he wasn't alone. There, across the room, sat a man. A stranger. But this was no ordinary man. His features were disturbingly familiar. "Who are you?" Felix demanded, getting to his feet. The man looked at him with a wry grin. "You already know me, Felix. You just don't remember." The man's eyes gleamed with something otherworldly. And then Felix understood, this man wasn't from his timeline at all. You're from the future," Felix whispered. His heart skipped a beat. Why are you here?" The man tilted his head. "I'm here to tell you something, Felix. Something important. That virus you're messing with? It's not an accident. You're part of a future experiment. An experiment that's going to change everything." Felix's pulse quickened. "What do you mean? What virus?" "The quantum virus," the man replied, his voice growing more intense. "You triggered it. And now you're the only one who can stop it." The man across the room stood up slowly, his eyes locked onto Felix's with a chilling intensity. Felix's legs wobbled beneath him, a sense of vertigo sweeping over him. He had no idea what was happening anymore. His body felt like it wasn't his own, or worse, that it was slipping out of time, disappearing into the cracks between moments. "You're not supposed to be here," Felix muttered, taking a step back, his mind whirling. "Who are you really? Are you some kind of future version of me?" The man smiled a knowing, eerie smile that made Felix's skin crawl. "In a way, yes. I'm you. Or, rather, I'm one version of you. A version from a timeline that you've already forgotten. Or will forget. Or never will know." The man's words flowed like syrup, each syllable laced with more mystery than Felix could handle. He reached out, touching the nearest table for balance. It felt like the room itself was shifting around him, stretching like rubber bands, as though the very space couldn't hold its shape anymore. "I'm here because of the quantum virus." Felix's heart skipped a beat. That term again. "The virus, what do you mean, because of the virus?" Felix croaked. "I don't know what you're talking about." The virus is your fault," the man interrupted, his voice suddenly dark, sharp. "But not in the way you think. You created it. The chronobox wasn't just an experiment to play with time. It was a trigger. An accelerator. A tool for a much greater project. You've been infected, Felix. And now everything you knew, everything is going to change." Felix blinked, trying to make sense of the words. His mind grasped for an anchor, but everything felt like it was slipping through his fingers. A cold sweat broke out across his forehead. "I didn't mean to," Felix whispered, almost pleading, looking at the stranger who was now eerily close to him. "It wasn't supposed to be like this. I just wanted to understand quantum mechanics, to understand time. I never meant to." The man raised a hand, cutting him off. "It doesn't matter what you meant. It's already happened. The experiment was never just about discovering time travel. It was always about testing something much more dangerous. The quantum virus isn't an accidental byproduct. It's the whole point of the project." Felix shook his head, disoriented. "But the virus, it changes things at the genetic level, right? It's altering life. It's rewriting evolution," the man said flatly. "It's creating new timelines, new versions of reality. It's adjusting life, not just at the molecular level, but on the quantum level. Your chronobox sent ripples through the fabric of time. And each ripple didn't just change your reality, it infected every version of you that could ever exist. You're all carrying the virus now. And the more you try to fix it, the more you spread it." Felix's mind raced. The implications were staggering. If what this man said was true, and it had to be, considering what he had just experienced, then the virus wasn't something that could simply be cured. It wasn't an illness. It was a fundamental alteration of reality itself. "Why me?" Felix asked, his voice hoarse. "Why did you choose me? What makes me the one to fix it?" The man smiled again, but this time it wasn't reassuring. "I didn't choose you, Felix. You chose yourself. You were always going to do this. I'm just here to give you a push. You're the key to stopping the virus, but also the key to unleashing it fully." Felix's breath hitched. The weight of the man's words pressed down on him, threatening to crush him. He stumbled backward, his thoughts spinning in circles, trying desperately to latch onto something, anything that could explain how the hell this had all gone so wrong. "You've changed everything, Felix," the man continued, pacing slowly around the lab. "Every action you take now will cause another version of you to spring into existence. There's no such thing as a single timeline anymore. And as long as the virus spreads, as long as you continue to experiment with time, the boundaries between you and the future, between you and the past, will continue to blur. You'll never know which reality you're in. You'll be trapped." Felix clutched at his head, trying to stem the tide of panic building inside him. What can I do? How do I stop it?" The man's eyes gleamed with an almost pitying amusement. "The only way to stop it is to go back to the source. To go back to the moment the virus was first introduced into the timeline. But you can't. Not alone." Felix's heart hammered in his chest. "But how can I get there? I've already tried to go back, but the chronobox—" "You'll need help," the man interrupted again. "You'll need someone from the future." Felix froze. "Someone from the future? Who?" A soft laugh escaped the man's lips, like he was enjoying some private joke. "Oh, you've met her already. You've always met her." Felix's mind raced, trying to piece it all together. Then it hit him. The strange woman who had appeared in his lab just moments ago, the one who had told him the virus wasn't just a mistake, but a deliberate act. Ilara, Felix whispered. "You're talking about her, aren't you?" The man's eyes softened. "She's not who you think she is. But yes, she's the key. She's the one who will help you undo the damage you've caused. She's the only one who can guide you to the critical moment, the moment when the virus was introduced into your timeline." Felix's pulse quickened. He had to find her. He had to fix this. But the thought of meeting her again, of trusting someone who could be, who knows what, was almost too much to bear. She was from the future, but which future? And what if she didn't want to help? What if she was just another player in this vast cosmic experiment? "You're running out of time," the man said, reading Felix's thoughts, his voice growing more insistent. The virus is spreading. Reality itself is starting to destabilize. You need to find her now. Or every reality will collapse. Felix nodded, swallowing hard. He could feel the weight of this mission pressing down on him, suffocating him. He had to do this. For the sake of his own existence, for the sake of the entire future, he had to find Alara. I'll do it, Felix said, determination creeping into his voice. I'll find her. I'll stop the virus. The man gave him a grim smile. Don't be so sure. Once you start down this path, there's no turning back. And Alara, she's not exactly on your side. Felix stood tall, the fear slowly giving way to something else. Resolve, I'll take my chances, Felix replied. The following days were a blur. Felix knew he didn't have much time, but the more he tried to trace Alara's whereabouts, the more tangled the timelines became. He could feel the quantum virus inside him, shifting his perception of reality, making every decision feel like a gamble. Every step was fraught with the knowledge that one wrong move could unravel everything. He was constantly followed by the sense that this reality wasn't his own, that he was only a visitor here, borrowing someone else's life. He spent countless hours in the lab, scanning the data from the chronobox, attempting to trace Alara's movements, but the virus had already begun distorting the timeline. Each time he thought he found a clue, it slipped through his fingers like smoke. Felix was about to give up when he noticed something strange, a pattern in the data. A series of anomalies. A flicker, barely perceptible, but there. A window into a moment in time. It was Alara. She was standing in the exact place where he had first met her, a cold, empty alleyway behind the university, the place where reality had first started to crack. Felix ran. The virus was pulling him in, but he had no choice. Time was running out when he found her. Alara was standing there, waiting, her face unreadable. She didn't say a word, just looked at him with a mixture of recognition and pity. You're too late, she said softly, her voice tinged with regret. The virus is already spreading too far. You've changed too much. Felix shook his head, his breath ragged. We can still fix it. I know we can. I have to stop it, Alara. Please. She studied him for a long moment before finally speaking. You can't. But I can. And with those words, the world around Felix shifted again, violently this time, as the timeline splintered into 1,000 possibilities. Felix's heart slammed against his ribcage as the world around him began to twist. The air around him hummed with a low, constant vibration, like the very fabric of existence was being stretched and torn apart. His vision blurred, then snapped back into focus. Alara's eyes, those cold, calculating eyes, held him in place. You can't stop it, Felix, she said again, her voice softer now, almost as if she were trying to console him. The virus is already part of you. Part of everything. Felix clenched his fists, his teeth gritted. I can't just sit here and watch everything fall apart. I won't. She stepped forward, a small, sad smile playing at the corners of her lips. You think you have control, but you don't. The virus isn't something you can stop. It's too embedded in the timeline now. You're the anchor, Felix. The moment you activated the chronobox, you triggered a shift. Now, the entire universe is evolving according to its rules, not yours. It's already gone too far. He shook his head, forcing himself to focus, to think. I won't let it be for nothing. There's got to be a way to reverse it. If I can just figure out when and where the virus originated. You are the origin, she interrupted. You think the virus came from the future? That it's something they put into your timeline? No. It's not just a virus, Felix. It's a key. A key that unlocks the next stage of human evolution. You and I were the test subjects. You, with all your brilliant little experiments. And me. She trailed off for a moment, her gaze turning inward, as if she were struggling with her own thoughts. I'm the result. The endgame. Felix felt a cold shiver race down his spine. He tried to make sense of her words, but his mind was too overloaded, too scrambled by everything that had happened, and was still happening. The virus was altering the very structure of reality around him. He could feel it in his bones, in the way the air around him tasted different, in the way the shadows seemed to stretch and warp, as if time itself were bending toward him, pulling him deeper into its twisted grasp. "No," he said, more to himself than to her. "I don't believe you. This can't be the end. I can fix this. I can still do something." Ilara's expression softened for the briefest of moments, but there was something almost pitying in her gaze, like she was watching a child who thought he could outrun the inevitable. "You can't. You never could." Felix's mind spun wildly. He had to stop the virus. He had to find a way to go back to the beginning, to undo everything he'd set in motion, to separate himself from the contamination he'd become. "I can't just give up," Felix said, his voice raw with the weight of his desperation. He stepped forward, his body trembling but his resolve firm. "Tell me how to fix it. I don't care what it takes." Ilara studied him for a long time, her gaze flickering with something unreadable. Then, almost imperceptibly, she nodded. "There's one way. But it's not a path you can walk alone. And it's a path that might cost you everything." Felix's pulse quickened. "What do you mean?" "You have to go back. Go back to the very moment the virus was introduced into the timeline. Not just in your reality, but in every reality. You have to isolate the virus's source and erase it from existence. Completely." Felix swallowed, his throat dry. "That sounds impossible." "It's not," she said, her tone suddenly intense, almost urgent. "The chronobox is your key. But you'll need more than that. You'll need to access the core of the timeline itself, to manipulate the quantum data at a fundamental level. You'll need to break through the entanglement, the knot that holds all the possibilities together. Only then can you reverse the damage." Felix felt his mind racing, his thoughts tumbling over each other, trying to catch up. The very idea of manipulating the core of time and existence was beyond anything he could have imagined. It sounded insane. But he knew, he felt that Ilara wasn't lying. She wasn't just a random stranger from the future. She was tied to this, tied to him, tied to the quantum virus, in ways he couldn't fully comprehend. "You can't do it alone," she said again, her voice softening. "The virus has already spread too far. It's embedded in your quantum signature. You need help." Felix looked at her, confusion and frustration washing over him in waves. "From who? How can anyone help me if—" "Ilara," a voice interrupted, cutting through the haze in Felix's mind. The voice was sharp, clear, distinctly familiar. Felix spun around, heart racing in his chest, and found himself staring at another version of himself. This new version of Felix, this future version, looked different. His face was gaunter, more lined, his eyes bloodshot but determined. His hands were shaking slightly, but his posture was rigid, commanding. "What? What are you doing here?" Felix stammered, his voice trembling. I thought I was." "You were," the future Felix said, his voice steady. "You were right where I was. But the timeline has split. We're here now because the virus is no longer just inside you. It's inside everything." Felix's breath caught in his throat. "You're me," he whispered. "Another version of you," the future Felix said with a sigh, running a hand through his unkempt hair. "We don't have time to explain everything. But I'm here to help you stop it. Before it destroys all of us." Ilara looked at the future version of Felix, a flicker of something, recognition, maybe, or something deeper passing between them. "I thought you were done with this." "I was," the future Felix replied curtly. "But I've learned something. Something important. The virus isn't just a quantum anomaly. It's a virus with a purpose. It was meant to push evolution forward. And we are the ones meant to help it along. Felix's head swam. Evolution? You mean this whole thing is part of some experiment? Some project from the future? Yes, the future, Felix replied, his gaze never leaving Elara. And you and I, we're part of the experiment. We've been chosen to carry out this mission. Not because we're the best. Not because we're the smartest. But because we're the only ones who can. Felix's mind reeled. He looked at Elara, then back at the future version of himself. The words they were speaking felt like some kind of twisted riddle. But it was clear now, this wasn't just about fixing the virus. This wasn't just about time travel or quantum physics. This was about evolution. About what it meant to change the course of humanity's future, about what the virus was meant to do, about how it was supposed to reshape existence itself. You said we can't stop it, Felix said, his voice low and filled with disbelief. You said it was too far gone. Elara stepped forward, her expression unreadable. The virus is inevitable, Felix. But that doesn't mean you can't control it. You have to make the decision. You have to choose which path to take. Do you stop it, or do you let it continue? Felix looked at them both, at Elara, at the version of himself from the future. He could feel the weight of the choice pressing down on him. There was no way out. There was no simple solution. But there was one thing he knew, deep in his gut, something that he had known from the very beginning: he wasn't just going to let this happen. Not like this. Then let's stop it, Felix said, his voice firm. Let's fix this. Once and for all. Elara's gaze softened, her expression shifting. You'll need help. You can't do it alone. Felix nodded. He knew. He'd been alone too long. And now, at the edge of reality itself, he had a choice to make. And he was going to make it. One way or another. The room seemed to shimmer as the timelines shifted once again, converging on that single point. Felix took a deep breath, and for the first time in a long while, he felt like he had control over something, anything. The future was waiting, but it was up to him to decide what came next. End of story.